It's Wednesday, October 4th, 2023. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today on the campus of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, with Professor James W. Riddlesperger, Jr. Dr. Riddlesperger earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from North Texas State University, which is now the University of North Texas, and his PhD from the University of Missouri. A native of Denton, Texas, he is taught at TCU since 1982, and his research interests include American politics, the presidency, Congress, and Texas politics. He is co-author of Texas Politics, Ideal and Reality, Lone Star Leaders, and the Austin-Boston Connection. He has also co-edited Reflections on Rayburn, Considering American Government, a Reader, The Right Stuff, that's W-R-I-G-H-T, Presidential Leadership and Civil Rights Policy, and Special Focus, Balance of Power Between Congress and the President. He has been named Honors Professor of the Year at TCU, and he is the winner of the Chancellor's Award for Creative Teaching and Research. Dr. Riddlesperger, Jim, so good to finally meet in person and spend some time talking politics and getting your take on the current state of American politics.
Well, let's go.
Right. Well, usually I start at the beginning with your childhood and upbringing, but since we're at yet another unprecedented event in American political history, the Speaker of the House has been forced to vacate the chair, Kevin McCarthy. I want to get your take as somebody who's studied speakers of the House and their influence and their role in American politics. I want to get your take on Speaker McCarthy's ouster.
Well, his ouster, of course, was inevitable the moment that he was elected because of all the deals he had to make in order to get elected in the first place. And of course, the one that came back to bite him was the motion to vacate agreement that he had. And eventually it just proved that the House is unmanageable at this point. Now, it is the case that he's the first one to be voted out. Now, you mentioned my good friend Jim Wright, and Wright actually left under relatively similar circumstances. He resigned the speakership largely because he didn't think he would have the votes to be able to sustain his speakership. Now, he later in life said he should have fought the charges, but that's a different issue. But his issues had to do with honestly minor violations of House ethics rules, and even technical questions as to whether those...
It was bulk book buying, wasn't it?
Correct, which was probably not even a technical violation of the rules, because royalties were acceptable ways of making money, and there was no statement of how big those royalties could be, and there was no statement of how the books were to be sold in the House ethics. So it was clearly an attempt on his part to kind of evade House ethics, but he probably didn't technically violate them. Of course, that doesn't matter when the feeding frenzy starts, as it did in his case. So McCarthy's case, of course, McCarthy's huge mistake was to actually talk to Democrats. And that really set the forces in motion to get Matt Gaetz and his band of 7 supporters to cast the deciding votes to remove him from office.
I was listening to the Daily podcast, and it was sort of a surreal moment when they said that, the House managed a bipartisan temporary funding bill, and that was cast as a negative, that it was a bipartisan bill. At this point, do you think that we're going to get some sort of cross-party agreement, or is there going to be another effort to install a Republican who's going to try and lead the same way that McCarthy has?
Well, I mean, I don't think that anyone who is in a position to become Speaker would be willing to make the compromises that Kevin McCarthy made, given what happened to Kevin McCarthy.
Sure.
And while members of Congress are not known for being quick-witted, they aren't dumb either. They learn from these kinds of things. So is it possible that the Republican Party could elect a speaker? I would say that it's possible, just like it was possible for them to elect Kevin McCarthy. The problem is, when I go through those 212 names, I don't see who that person is.
Right.
And so I don't hold out that it can't happen. We jokingly said, is there another Dennis Hastert in the party? Because the dynamics of that coalition were relatively similar. And Hastert was selected as Speaker of the House because he was the least offensive member of the majority party.
Also an ironic statement, given what we
given what we now know. And of course, Jim Jordan was a wrestling coach too, which is another interesting story. But the key is that almost certainly, in order to get to that magic number of 218 votes to be elected Speaker of the House, there's going to have to be some cooperation with Democrats at some level. How might that happen is anyone's guess. Might Hakeem Jeffries agree to have a dozen members of the Democratic Party vote present instead of voting for a Republican Speaker, and then have something happen where there's some kind of a power-sharing arrangement that would allow the Democrats...
So rules, committee assignment, something like that.
And what that might look like, I don't know, but that would obviously give a Republican Speaker a little bit of sway, in the sense that if he could be assured, or she could be assured, that they couldn't be removed through a motion to vacate easily, I think that would make it possible to be a speaker. But I don't see a route to being a speaker that does not involve some level of bipartisan cooperation.
Because otherwise it's a replay of 15 ballots.
And we know, so the vote for the continuing resolution had 125 Republicans who voted for it, but there were 90 who voted against it. And so, those 90 are obviously dissatisfied. And while only 8 ended up voting against Kevin McCarthy, that doesn't mean that those other 82 were happy with the politics in the House of Representatives, and some portion of them might join in that coalition. I think everyone is surprised that neither Lauren Boebert nor Marjorie Taylor Greene voted for the ouster, and there were still 8 Republicans who did.
So I was very surprised to see Nancy Mace, moderate Republican from Charleston, vote to oust, but not, as you said, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Even Gosar voted for him. There are
usually the Arizona Mafia stick together.
So there are a number of very conservative Republicans who are out there on the wings, and while they didn't vote to oust Kevin McCarthy, that doesn't mean they wouldn't vote to oust Jim Jordan or Steve Scalise or whoever the Republicans might come up with a new speaker.
Well, there is a speaker pro tem, which is a relatively new or unique position with Patrick McHenry, who you would think in a previous time, in a simpler time, would probably make a very good Speaker of the House. What can we expect from this sort of interregnum period where you have a speaker pro tem and power, one assumes, would be a bit more diffuse and decentralized?
Yeah, we're in unprecedented...
That's one way of saying a power vacuum.
Right. We're in unprecedented territory here. Again, I think that the only possible route to making policy at this point is with at least a nod to bipartisanship. And I have to say that, McHenry's first act apparently was to remove Nancy Pelosi from her former Speaker's office in the Capitol and really anger her. And the question of how that's going to be translated into some kind of bipartisan cooperation with the most revered member in the Democratic Party is something that escapes me. So I'm not quite sure what his thought process was there.
Well, can you envision, we talked about Jim Wright, but could you envision something like this happening to a Sam Rayburn or a Tip O'Neill or a Nancy Pelosi? That there's this sort of just...
Well, this wouldn't have happened to Jim Wright either. This is This is just unprecedented. I mean, the job of a Speaker of the House is to talk with the leadership of the other political party and to put together a coalition to govern. That's their job. That's what they do. And rarely in American history have we had a Speaker who was able to govern without that. I mean, Rayburn and Wright and O'Neill had to deal with the conservative coalition, which included a number of Southern Democrats. Yep. I mean, you're from Georgia. Southern Democrats cooperating with Republicans to try to block progressive legislation. And so, the mantra during that entire period was, my gosh, if you're going to pass any legislation at all, you're going to have to do it on a bipartisan basis.
Right. And for so long, the call has been for a return to regular order, which has been so long, it's not really regular anymore. It would be, it would be such a callback to the 80s and 90s of committees and amendments, which to their credit, I don't know. We can go back and forth on how sincere these calls for regular order and opening the amendment process are, but that has been something that conservative rump has called for. Whether you can actually do that and have with the Republican caucus remains to be seen. But Nancy Pelosi was able to hold together her caucus with similar numbers in the last Congress.
And she was quite open and explicit in her lecturing of the left wing of her party, and eventually brought them into line. Because she told them, look, if we want to do anything, you're going to have to, as she says frequently, follow the leader, because we can either accomplish nothing by being divided, or we can unite and we can accomplish many of the things that you want to accomplish. I'm sure Kevin McCarthy had that in mind as his speakership, but you have to have people who are willing to play if it's going to work, and it's not clear that there are. It's clear that there are a dozen, maybe 20 members of the Republican coalition that are not going to consistently play that game.
Well, I mean, stay tuned, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So back to our regular scheduled program here. Tell me about your childhood upbringing. You grew up in Denton, Texas.
I grew up in Denton, Texas.
Which I'm sure was very different than the Denton, Texas
absolutely.
today.
It was about 20,000 people when I grew up. It was a typical southern town. It was a university town, so that made it a little bit different. We had both the University of North Texas, or what we called North Texas State College back in those days, and Texas Women's University right there in Denton. So there were two state institutions, which made Denton a little bit unusual even at the time. But in other regards, it was very much a county seat town. It was a typical Texas town in the South where the white population lived on one side of the railroad tracks and the black population was on the other side. Denton was a small enough town that they accomplished desegregation by simply closing the black school. Yep. That was something that happened
as old as time.
in the 1960s. So in many ways, I tell people all the time that I grew up in Mayberry, and I watched Andy Griffith all those years, not realizing that was meant to be a comedy, because it was kind of like the politics of Denton.
Did you have an Otis that got locked up?
I'm sure there was.
I'm sure there were more than one.
Yeah.
So did your family grow up, following politics, involved in politics?
Oh yeah, I'm a second generation political scientist. So yes. Political discussions were the norm at our house. They happened all the time. My parents were a mixed marriage. My dad was from the South, grew up in East Texas, and my mother was from Minnesota. They even discovered that their families fought on opposite sides during that unfortunate war between the states. It was a we always had different perspectives than the typical Texas perspective. And of course, I grew up on a university campus where even in the South during the 60s, 50s and 60s, there was a diversity of opinion with people from all over the country and people with different perspectives. So while Denton was very much kind of a typical Southern town in that sense, I grew up, my father was always the sponsor of the International Students Organization, so I grew up with international students in the house and eating what was then exotic food from the Middle East or India or Thailand, which, typical Texans had never tasted anything more exotic than beef ribs. So it was a very, very different kind of upbringing in that sense, even though I grew up in the South.
Well, it sounds like that you grew up in a family whose politics was relatively progressive.
My father was a New Deal Democrat. That's why I have the Franklin Roosevelt and John Nance Garner campaign posters from 1932. That he unfortunately decoupaged instead of framed, but that's another issue.
Yeah, it's not archival standards.
No, that's right.
We prioritize reversibility.
Right, there you go.
So of preservation, but
yeah,
they're here.
Absolutely.
So tell me, you grew up. A lot of kids don't necessarily follow in their parents' footsteps. Was that something that from an early age you were interested in politics and
yes,
considered that a
path? I grew up in Texas, so the two things we talked about was football and politics.
Were you a Mean Green fan?
Oh, absolutely, including before it was the Mean Green. In fact, I still refuse to call it the Mean Green. I call it the Eagles. But Joe Green was there when I was growing up, so yes, I remember watching North Texas play. And of course, North Texas was the first of the state universities in Texas to desegregate, which is why in the late 50s and early 60s, they probably had the best football team in the state, even though the Southwest Conference teams would not play them, obviously.
Right.
So that was Abner Haynes was an early star at North Texas,
yeah.
and then Joe Green later on. So that was another area where Denton was just a little bit different from other parts of the state. But yeah, we grew up talking politics. We grew up thinking about politics on a kind of an ongoing basis. Did I intend to become a political scientist? The answer is no. Like all prospective political scientists, I suspect, I was going to go to law school. And I was going to become the next Clarence Darrow or some equivalent thereof. Maybe Perry Mason is a closer accurate to accurate, but what happened was I graduated in 3.5 years, and the department chair of the political science department at North Texas came up to me and he said, "I have a teaching assistantship available for the spring semester. I can pay you $900 to be essentially a grader for one of our faculty members." And I said, "Gosh, where do I sign up?" And that forced me to go into a master's program. And at the end of that term, I chose not to go to law school and said, I'll finish my master's degree, then I'll go to law school.
Sure.
But by the time that next year went by, I did apply. I had acceptance at 2 law schools here in Texas and had put them off and said I would come in the fall of '77. And by the time the fall of '77 came around, I decided to go to graduate school instead.
So what were your research interests as a graduate student?
Well, interestingly, my dissertation's on state politics and state environmental energy politics at that. So I would say that probably my interest...
It's very timely for today.
My interest was in federal assistance to the states on energy environmental considerations. And the trade-off of energy and the environment, which still exists to some degree, but much more so at the time when energy was entirely fossil fuels.
Right.
And so I was looking into that. I was writing my dissertation just as Ronald Reagan got elected president and dismantled all of the federal aid to the states
Secretary
with regard to the energy and the environment. And so my dissertation became kind of a historical wonder by the time it was finished, but that was my early interest, was in that, and of course I've maintained an interest in state politics during that entire time. Then of course once I got here, I began teaching national politics. I was always interested in national politics as well, and got involved in presidential research group here in political science, and then when Jim Wright retired from Congress and came to the TCU campus for the next 20 years, I had my probably bi-monthly lunches with him, and then we put together what was known as the Jim Wright Symposium, which still exists, and it brought in former colleagues of his on an annual basis to talk about the state of national politics and of Congress. And that led to a number of my research interests as well. So I've kind of narrowed myself down to state politics, and of course Texans being as nationalistic as they are, a focal point on Texas politics, and then national political institutions.
Well, let's take a step back, because I remember seeing that you did some oral histories at University of North Texas, probably when you were a master's student.
That was actually my father that did those oral histories.
That was your father who did those. So your father
Yeah.
interviewed Charlie Wilson.
Yes,
and your father.
although we had Charlie Wilson here for the Jim Wright Symposium, so I got to spend a couple of days with Charlie myself. So yeah.
What did the Tom Hanks portrayal live up to the real thing?
Oh no, Charlie in person was far more interesting than Tom Hanks. Charlie Wilson was one of the most dynamic people that you'll ever meet. I mean, he was walking charisma, and he was characterized. I think in my Lone Star Leaders book, I have the famous quote of him that he was when he went to the Naval Academy, of course, and when he was on the boat, his commander said he was the best soldier or the best person that he'd ever seen on the ship, and the worst he'd ever supervised off the ship. And that continued to be his mantra throughout his congressional career. And of course, Jim Wright, when he ran for majority leader, you remember winning by one vote, the person he chose to give his nominating speech was Charlie Wilson, because of his personal popularity in
Good time,
in
Charlie.
Congress. Yeah.
That was. So tell me why you attended University of Missouri, Mizzou, which is right down the road from my alma mater.
Yeah, and the answer is because I stupidly didn't apply to very top tier PhD programs. I was accepted to every program I applied to. Missouri just happened to be one of those. They had some very good scholars there. In fact, the precursors to my interest were Wayne Francis, who was one of the leading state politics scholars in the country at that time, and Dick Watson, who was one of the leading presidential scholars in the country at the time. They were the two highest profile people in the department, and the promise to be able to work with both of them was something that was very attractive to me, and I ended up working with Wayne for my dissertation.
Did you enjoy your time in Columbia, which, in my opinion, is one of the best college towns in America?
How can you not?
That's right.
For exactly the reason you say.
Broadway and...
It was, well, I mean, the thing about Columbia at the time is it was not only a college town, but it was revered. Where you run into town gown competition in a lot of college towns, where the townspeople really don't appreciate the craziness associated with college students. College students in Columbia were revered, and revered to the point of being, welcomed as kind of conquering heroes when they came as freshmen, and then treated like royalty for the 4 years they were there. So Columbia was really very supportive of the college experience.
Yeah, I think I think it's something about the Midwest, and again, I say this as a native Midwesterner, that those sort of college relations are a bit more symbiotic,
right,
in the Midwest than they are in some other places.
Yeah, compared to Denton, for example. I just told you about Denton,
Yeah.
and there really was town gown competition in Denton. The townspeople thought that those egg-headed professors were problems to some degree, whereas in Columbia it was just not that way at all.
Right. So you taught for a bit at Mizzou, but TCU was your first and only stop so far. Tell me about that process of coming back home, I guess.
Yeah.
More or less.
It was really funny because I got 3 job offers on the same day. I got a job offer at the University of Kentucky. That was a 1-year position, but there was hope for that to become a tenure track position.
That eternal hope.
And a promise. The chair there was Lee Siegelman at the time, and he said, no, you'll have the inside track, and in fact we'll try our dead level best to make sure that you have an opportunity to stay. and then Texas Tech offered me a one-year position in Lubbock, and TCU offered me a tenure track job. TCU's primary attraction, there were two. One is my family was here in the Metroplex. My parents were in Denton. I had a sister in Denton. I had another sister in Dallas and another sister halfway between. So my whole family was here. And then secondly, TCU offered me the magnificent sum of $19,000 a year, which was $3,000 more than anybody else was offering. And when you think about that, at that time, that was a huge amount of money.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah. So I was surprised at how much I was offered, and it was an easy decision to come to TCU.
Well, what was TCU like back in 1982?
TCU was in transition at that point.
Okay.
From being a kind of traditional little, church church-related undergraduate liberal arts school to try to translate itself into a national university. We were in the second of 3 years of 20% per year raises for faculty members.
You're making me very jealous.
Yes, that we were looking at that time. A significant portion of the people who were on the faculty and staff here had been undergraduates at TCU who had come back.
Sure.
And so we were right at the cusp of doing national searches to really bring in people from top tier universities to kind of transform this. We were also investing in scholarships and competition to get better students. And so it was really a school that was just at the cusp of trying to become a significant player in the national college experience, and has really continued down that track over the 40. Now this is my 42nd year at TCU, so it's been interesting. TCU's more than doubled in size since then. There were 5,500 students when I came to TCU. They're pushing 12,000 now.
More importantly, what was the football team like back then?
Football team stunk. The football team, TCU had the worst football team in the country in the 1970s. The year before I came here, TCU was 1-8-2 in football. I always told people that compared to Kentucky, that had been, I think, 0-11 that year before or something, that I came here for the football. But no, TCU had a terrible football program and had really not had a good football team since 1959. And the first good team we had was the 1984 team that went to the Bluebonnet Bowl. That caused its own problem because back in the days when you couldn't pay players, it became revealed that the Southwest Conference actually had a pay scale for divvying up players, and TCU's mistake had been that they had chosen the wrong players, I think. But that was a different time in football, and of course, for things that are now absolutely 100% normal.
Oh yeah, well, right down the road. Which way? Right down the road is Southern Methodist University.
Yeah.
The Pony Express.
The Pony Express. Yeah.
But the famous saying, you've got a payroll to make.
That's right.
And that was true.
The famous line from Governor Bill Clements about paying the payers. He says, "Well, there wasn't a Bible in the room." I'm thinking, wow.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of something more quintessentially Texas than the SMU scandal, where you had the sitting governor, embroiled in a NCAA pay-to-play controversy, which
absolutely.
Ended in the death penalty for SMU, and SMU's finally recovered from that.
I'm not sure they've recovered even yet.
Well, they're certainly not back to the Eric Dickerson.
Well,
Pat
no,
McElhaney
and they're they have problems in terms of fan support. They've got plenty of money, but they have not been able to build a fan base over there, which explains why Sonny Dykes came back to TCU instead of staying at SMU. In part, I mean, obviously TCU was in a Power 5 conference as well, but that was only one factor. I mean, I think if everything had been right at SMU, he would have been tempted to stay there.
Sure. Well, tell me about, you mentioned Jim Wright and Speaker Wright, and him coming to TCU. Tell me about how your interest in congressional politics, speakers of the House, how that emerged and developed over time.
Well, I was always interested in Congress. I always followed Congress. I remember I was in Washington in a summer study program in 1975, and I remember meeting Jim Wright then, and I spent a couple of hours with Lloyd Benson and a couple of hours with John Tower way back then as well. And I'd grown up being interested in Congress. Remember very well Sam Rayburn, for example, as Speaker of the House, even though he died when I was really quite young. And my father was a very close friend of another congressman from Texas, Graham Purcell, from Wichita Falls, and was a childhood friend of Ralph Yarbrough's, who was in the United States Senate from Texas. I tell people all the time that I'm the only person I know that gave up my bed at one point for Ralph Yarbrough. He was campaigning during the 1964 election. I know it had to be that election because that was the year he was reelected. But he came to our house. I was the only one at home, knocked on the door. He was driving himself, had no staff, and said, I'm Ralph Yarbrough, and I didn't know who Ralph Yarbrough was. Obviously, I was 10 or 11 years old, and he said, your daddy invited me to come over, and I'm going to stay here. And sure enough, he stayed in my bedroom that night. And I still remember, and I don't do a very good Ralph Yarbrough imitation, but still remember him saying, I don't know why I would spend $10 to stay at the Holiday Inn when there's a perfectly good bed right here. I like to tell that story because it tells you so much about how the politics have changed in the United States. I can't even imagine
a little bit.
A sitting incumbent U.S. Senator driving a borrowed 1957 Chevy by himself. He had done an event apparently at noon in Denton, and then just came over to my parents' house to spend the night, and got up in the morning and had breakfast and headed out for another day of campaigning.
Yeah, that doesn't. I'm trying to think. That doesn't happen too much anymore,
No.
especially at the Senate level.
Yeah.
So was Jim Wright? Did he represent this part of Texas?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Fort Worth. He was the. This is a really distinguished congressional district. He was preceded by two. The man he defeated was not a particularly distinguished member of Congress, but the person who had been here before him was Fritz Lanham, who had been who was the son of a former Texas governor and had been a very influential member of Congress. And of course, his successor by two is Kay Granger, who is now the chair of the House Appropriations Committee. So this has been a district that has had very powerful people involved in it over a long period of time.
Has the Metroplex always had sort of an outsized influence over Texas politics, or has sort of like Georgia, where the urban and suburban centers were on the outside looking in during malapportionment during the Civil Rights Movement?
During the Civil Rights Movement, I think that's the case, that the cities were not nearly as influential. I mean, in the Austin-Boston connection, we kind of pursue that theme to some degree, because Texas was really divided. It's too simple to say that it was divided into two areas, but it kind of was. Deep East Texas, anything kind of to the east of Interstate 45 now, running between Dallas and Houston, is very southern in its orientation, and had all of the attributes of southern.
Piney Woods.
The piney woods, behind the pine tree curtain, as my father used to say. And he grew up in that part of Texas, and had the racial politics of the South, and cotton was a big crop in that part of the state. There had been some plantations there before the Civil War, so it has a very, very different atmosphere. When you got outside of the deep East Texas, Texas did not have a lot of racial diversity, and to the degree that there was racial diversity, it was Hispanic diversity rather than African American diversity. And Hispanics have always been more acceptable in Texas because, as they are always willing to point out, they were here before the white people, and so that was an ongoing issue. But if you look at the leaders in the Texas congressional delegation, John Nance Garner from Uvalde, who no one apparently had ever heard of before the shooting there a couple of years ago.
Sadly,
despite the fact that Garner was from there, as was Dolph Briscoe, another major leader in Texas political history. And then Sam Rayburn from Bonham, which was in northern East Texas, not really in the deep south part of East Texas. and then Jim Wright from here in Fort Worth. So the leaders in the Texas congressional delegation tended to be outside of the periphery of that Deep South influence in Texas. Even Lyndon Johnson, who also
Right.
should be mentioned in that context, the same thing. He was from the Austin area.
Right.
So
The big daddy of the Pedernales.
Right.
So you know, you're talking about how, in Georgia we always talk about the two Georgias problem, or the two Georgias, where you have Atlanta and everything else. Mm-hmm. What is it in Texas? How do you break down Texas?
It's the urban
politics?
split, urban-rural split, just exactly like it is in Georgia. The difference is that the urban areas are divided. So if you look in Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth is Democratic, Houston is Democratic, Austin's Democratic, San Antonio's Democratic, El Paso's Democratic. So the urban areas in Texas are very much like Atlanta in terms of their politics, and the rest of Texas is very much like outstate Georgia in that regard.
So, and that's been something that's a trend that I think, more people would have been less surprised had Texas turned blue in 2020 than they were that Georgia actually flipped to the Democratic, into the Democratic column. What's it going to take in Texas for the Democrats to get over the hump at the statewide level, at the presidential level?
Well, it's very complicated because, again, one of the things that's interesting is that Texas is a plurality Hispanic state at this point already. Okay. It will be a majority Hispanic state by 10 years from now. That's just a reality. The white population is declining. The African American population is remaining steady at about 12%, 12.5%. So the big minority factors in Texas politics are not black politics, but rather Hispanic politics. So I've always said to people, the question is not whether Texas is going to be red or blue, whether it's going to be rojo or azul. And I think that that's something that is hard to kind of put your handle on, because
that's gotten really complicated.
The Latino vote is very complicated. We know that people from different Latin American countries behave differently from one another. Second generation people are very different from first generation people, and so the Latino vote has never been a block vote like the black vote is. It runs at 65-35 or 70-30 rather than...
I assume there's also the rural-urban split of
rural-urban splits there as well.
Cities versus the valley.
Versus, the oil Texas versus non-oil Texas. I mean, all of those dynamics are in play with the Latino vote. And so it's very difficult to get your handle on, and therefore not as predictable, I think, as Georgia politics. But Georgia politics, of course, while Democrats have been successful in some ways, obviously that is not a one-party state, nor is it going to be. And our good friend Chuck Bullock has assured us that that's not likely to change. And I think that that's the same with Texas. The difference in Texas, of course, is the Republicans are firmly in control, and much more so than they are in Georgia. In fact, I would say to go beyond that, because you have Atlanta versus non-Atlanta in Georgia, you really have a pretty simple calculation. In Texas, obviously, all of those cities are different from one another. They all have their own little cultures as well, and so they aren't united in the same way that the Atlanta area is in Georgia politics. And so it's, for example, just to give you an example of the difficulties, if you're a candidate running for statewide office in Texas, remember that there are 5 media markets, massive media markets, as opposed to just one in Georgia. So the costs, not just in financial costs, but getting name recognition, getting organizations in each of those cities, having sponsors that can help you run a statewide campaign, are infinitely more complicated in Texas than they are in Georgia.
One thing in Georgia that was so important for the Democrats was the bluing of the suburbs, Cobb County, Gwinnett County, Henry County, those sort of the donut, basically, that really fueled the growth of the Republican Party in the 1980s and 1990s, is now fueling the growth of the Democratic Party, especially among college-educated white women, young professionals, groups like that. Is there a similar dynamic going on here in Texas as well?
Absolutely, there is. I would say that competition in the suburban areas in Texas is going to be what defines the possibilities of the growth of the Democratic Party in Texas. And obviously that is something that has played out, I think, particularly since Donald Trump has emerged. I have noticed among a number of women voters in suburban Texas that they've abandoned the Republican Party largely because they don't like Donald Trump. Whether the Republican Party can do anything to regain their trust, I think, is a different issue. And of course, when you add to that the abortion issue, I think that those two together have really meant that the educated suburban women are more likely to vote for Democrats than before. On the other hand, we seem to be seeing a little bit of backlash. We've already addressed the Latino vote, where Latino voters, I mean, there are a couple of counties down in the Valley of Texas where there was significant growth in the vote for Donald Trump compared in 2020 compared to 2016, including one county that he actually won in the Valley. And so there's that dynamic going on, and there's some indication that the black vote is being diluted a little bit as well. I mean, the mayor of Dallas, Eric Johnson, just switched from Democratic affiliation to a Republican affiliation last week, and he's a black mayor of a major city.
What do you think accounts for that? And if we had dead certain answers, you and I'd be out making lots of money as consultants.
Ain't that the truth? Yeah.
but what do you think accounts for that erosion of? Now, obviously, if you look at just 2016 numbers, Hillary Clinton was sort of a generational talent in turning out Hispanic voters at the presidential level for the Democrats. If you go back to George W. Bush, it's much more complex. But what do you think accounts for that change over time from 2016 to 2020? And you saw a similar trend in 2022, even with Beto O'Rourke's numbers not doing as well as he had done in 2018 among those Hispanic voters, especially in the Valley.
Oh, it's issue specific, I think.
Okay.
I think that I say it's issue specific. I mean, Texas. Well, I think oil politics has to do with it. I think abortion politics has to do with it. I think identity politics has to do with that. And so, like with everything else, I think there are a number of causes of transitional voting. But Donald Trump is a huge factor here.
Sure.
And I think that's a major thing. I mean, you mentioned Beto O'Rourke. O'Rourke is a really interesting person. I mean, those two elections you mentioned, I think, are valid. But he was running against Ted Cruz in 2018. And Ted Cruz is not beautifully liked anywhere. In fact, many of the people who voted for him did so based upon his party affiliation rather than their affinity for Ted Cruz in any real sense. And then Beto O'Rourke made that really poor choice to run for president and didn't fare well at all. So as we say, Beto 2.0 was a very different candidate from Beto 1.0.
Sure.
So making that kind of a comparison is difficult. And then Greg Abbott, I think, is a much, much better candidate than Ted Cruz.
I think we had a similar dynamic in Georgia with Stacey Abrams in 2018 versus 2022. Obviously, in 2018, it was an open seat.
Right.
So she wasn't running against a governor with a record of relative success, I would say.
Yeah, but then she became involved in national politics and national turnout the vote politics in Georgia, and she was a very different candidate in 2022.
Oh, very much so. So far, we've really talked about demographics, but what is it about the political organizations in the state? We go back of talking about John Nance Garner, LBJ. These folks who had sort of machines, for lack of a better term. What's the state of the political parties today?
The Republican
Texas?
Party has been the dominant party in Texas for now well more than a quarter of a century.
Sure.
They are much better organized. They have more money and particularly in Texas where there are concentrated pools of money, that is very helpful. And they have a deep bench. They've got a lot of people who
Sounds
held
very familiar.
public office in Texas, whereas the Democrats don't have anybody who's been elected to statewide, except for the chancellor of Texas A&M University, John Sharp, who's into his mid-70s or above even now. But he's, maybe literally the last person who in the Democratic Party who was elected to statewide office. They're just not anybody that has that. Beto O'Rourke, one of the reasons he ran in 2022 is the Democrats literally couldn't think of anybody else to run.
Right.
And so that's what happens. And so the Democrats, I think, have to do some grassroots organization. They have to build some organization. They have to build some possibilities of success. The other issue, and this is a really kind of a funny issue in Texas, is that the National Democratic Party doesn't want to pour many resources into Texas. They would rather pour resources into winning in states that have only one media market. The United States Senate is equal by state, not by population. And Texas has been an inexorable money machine for the National Democratic Party, because Democrats in Texas have tended to be the money bags that have been able to support successful Democratic candidates in swing states. So the National Democratic Party is, while they're sympathetic to the issues of Texas, they're making, I think, very rational decisions that national resources could be spent better elsewhere, and that Texas money can be helpful in doing that.
It's easier to invest in Atlanta, Maricopa County, and Clark County,
Absolutely.
Nevada.
And there's a lot of Texas money going into Arizona and Nevada and Georgia. Absolutely.
So it's interesting because you always hear so much about the competition between like California and Texas, but it's very much a similar thing that's happening in terms of political fundraising and spending. Those states are pouring money into the system that doesn't really get much in return, except one's a one-party Democratic state and one's a one-party Republican state.
That's correct. I always, my favorite statistic, the state with more Republicans than any other state is California. The state with the third largest number of Democrats is Texas. It's these are large states with large populations, and ergo, there are a lot of Republicans in California that are willing to donate money to national Republican candidates, and a lot of Democrats in Texas that are willing to contribute to national Democratic candidates.
Yeah, I think that's something that I think the general public sort of forgets about or doesn't think about is, you don't have. Thank you. Is this for me? Yeah, that you have a diversity within each of these states. I was just in California, out in the valley outside Sacramento.
Yeah.
You get outside Sacramento, it's nothing but pistachios and almonds and tomatoes. And it's just farms as far as you can see.
And pumpkins.
And pumpkins. I'm from Illinois. I'm used to seeing pumpkins. But,
I remember driving to Stockton and going through mile after mile of pumpkin patches. Oh, wow.
Well, it was, the latter seasons of The West Wing where you had Alan Alda's character, Arnie Vinnick, was a Republican senator from California running for president. A pro-choice Republican who won the Republican nomination. So there's more real America in California than anywhere else. I was like, that's classic
Yeah.
West Wing, classic West Wing. So you've been called, like a lot of political scientists. You've been called upon to offer analysis of campaigns and elections. Has that gotten harder?
Absolutely. It's gotten more difficult in a variety of ways, and I speak to a lot of civic groups in Fort Worth and in the surrounding areas, and I've cut back on that. I think partly because of age, but partly because it isn't as easy as it used to be. I get when I do an interview, I get negative email now that I used to not get. I get, when I speak to public groups, I often get people who push back, even though I'm not, trying to push any agenda.
Sure.
The fact that I'm not pushing their agenda is offensive to them. And the lion's share of that is on the Republican side, but there's also that feeling on the Democrat side. But it's clearly the politics and the discussion of politics, just an academic discussion of politics, has gotten far more acrimonious in recent years than it was before.
Why do you think that is? I think I know what your answer is.
Well, it's the polarization and the narrative of polarization. And the thing is that we have in political science, we have this debate, between, for want of a better term, the Alan Abramowitz view of politics, where we're deeply polarized, and that polarization is hard to bridge and cannot be bridged because of social media and politics, party leaders who have every incentive to divide people in the United States rather than to unite them.
Negative partisanship.
And Mo Fiorina's work that talks about the fact that at the end of the day, if we do a long list of the issues that are important to Americans, that there really is still a lot of commonality, and that there, we can point out, 15 issues that are partisan issues, but on most issues they're not. I mean, healthcare is a classic example of that. I mean, we, on the one hand, you had this Affordable Care Act passed, and of course it's far more controversial if it's called Obamacare because of polarization. But when you start actually talking about the ideas of health care, we find a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that Americans are far more interested in policies that work than they are in whether policies are liberal or conservative.
Right.
And that's true across the board. And so, my and I don't have a crystal ball. It's not murky.
You're not Larry Sabato?
One, right? I'm not Larry Sabato. Larry has a crystal ball about everything. But I think that the formula for someone who can kind of transform American politics is someone who's going to be able to redefine politics in a way that would emphasize issues on which there is not that polarized viewpoint, rather than on issues that spawn partisanship. And I have a number of examples of things that are that way. I mean, Americans are all for clean water and clean air. If you can formulate something that talks about those things rather than global warming or climate change, I think there's a possibility of having agreement there. Americans are all for energy self-sufficiency. How can you create that a narrative there? Americans are all for a good transportation. How can you develop a narrative there? Americans are for good education systems and law enforcement, and there's so many areas of commonality these are significant issues. I'm not talking about insignificant issues. And so someone who could form a narrative that would avoid the deeply divisive issues, and of course abortion is the stalking horse for that,
right?
Might be able to transcend some of those differences. Until then, Alan Abramowitz is the winner in that discussion.
So what we need is some sort of Frank Luntz focus group to figure out, transportation relief, or transportation cuts.
And I think to some degree, it's how you package these narratives that matters, and whether you can find. The problem. At the end of the day, I call it the 50% versus 5% problem. Right? The 50% problem is politicians need to get 50% of the vote in order to win. Well, that's not literally true, but all other things being equal, it's true, right? Whereas in order to be extraordinarily successful in the media, you need a 5% audience. And so the problem with and pick at Fox News or MSNBC, the problem with those organizations is they not only are not interested in a majority, but they're interested in serving their 5%, because their 5% is an audience that can make those networks a lot of money. And the result is there is absolutely no incentive not to demagogue. There is absolutely no incentive to try to be balanced. there's absolutely no incentive to try to tell the truth. Now, I think that there's a difference between the two, but the incentive structure is the same.
Until Dominion Voting Systems takes you to court.
Exactly. But I think that's the issue, right? So as long as our media, and I think it's the media far more than social media, are able to dominate the narrative in that way, it's going to be really difficult for someone to transcend that polarization.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, social media, I think we've seen a fracturing of social media, especially with folks who aren't boomers, Gen Xers,
right,
transitioning away from Facebook.
Well,
whatever Twitter is now called.
They're transitioning away from that one now too.
Yeah,
I mean, they're even transitioning away from TikTok. I mean, heaven knows what Instagram is going to be in 2 years.
Right.
So it's social media are much more difficult to kind of get your grip on.
Well, so much of it, like you were talking about, the popularity of issues broken down into very specific one issue thing. How much of this is the institutional impediment, the media being in the institution, but also the sort of undemocratic nature, small d democratic nature of the Senate, or gerrymandered districts in states. I'm from Illinois originally. The Democrats there can gerrymander a state just as well as any red state in the country. How much do those institutional impediments pay into or fuel this polarization and fuel sort of the gridlock?
Yeah, well,
I would, the sense that Congress doesn't work or government doesn't work.
I would argue that the Senate's a major impediment. I just did the math. And I'll have to come up with the right number again. But I just did the math. I think that the ratio between California and Wyoming is something like 63-1 in population, and the notion that Californians have two senators and Wyoming has two senators, a state with half the population of Fort Worth,
when you put it like that,
is interesting. I like to superimpose the map of Connecticut over the Dallas-Fort Worth area because they're almost exactly geographically the same size. And the state of Connecticut has 3.5 million people. Dallas-Fort Worth has 6.5 million people. The state of Connecticut has, in other words, 1% of the population and 2% of the Senate. Dallas-Fort Worth area doesn't have a single senator. Ted Cruz is from Houston, John Cornyn are from San Antonio, which are several states away if you're in the Northeast.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And while they're both from Texas, the idea of a metropolitan area of 6.5 million people not having a single representative in the Senate when they represent 2% of the population and should have two senators is pretty profound. And there's no way to kind of fix that problem without a fundamental rethinking of representation. And while it is the case that in the original 13 colonies that was a problem that was existing, the other 37 states are merely constructs that took place later. And so they weren't part of the original formula. And it's just an accident that Dakota has 4 senators. Why in the world is it North Dakota and South Dakota? Well, that was just a political decision that was made.
Right.
There was nothing normal there in terms of national politics. So that's something that happened kind of unintentional. Well, it was very intentional at the time, but I don't think anybody understood what the long-term consequences of those intentional political decisions were.
They weren't thinking in terms of the New Jersey plan and the Virginia
plan.
Right.
No, they weren't thinking big thoughts. They were thinking thoughts that had to do with race politics, had to do with Western expansion, and that was what the focal point was. And that's a major problem. And I don't know how you can rectify that. The problem in the House, I think, has much less to do with gerrymandering than it has to do with 2 things. The most important one is the decision that we made to have single-member districts with winner take all. There's no real reason we have to do that. And of course, the most advanced nations in the world have multi-member districts with proportional allocation of votes. We have a real problem in the United States where a significant number, 40%, I've not ever done it, it would be pretty easy to do the math, but 40% of Americans now live in districts where they're represented in Congress by 3 members of the other political party. Not a single person that has a voice. So if you live in this district and you're represented by Kay Granger and John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, and you're a Democrat, you're likely not going to feel very good about government because there's not a single voice in Congress that represents your perspective. And of course, the easy thing to do
my
is to
guess
talk
is
about.
at the state house, all the Democratic voters are probably in 1 or 2.
Yeah. So
districts.
you have that kind of a problem, and that's inherent. And it's complicated by the other problem that we have, and that is self-gerrymandering. So what's happened with this
the
mobile
great sort.
Yeah, right. So the mobility of our society has made it where liberals and Democrats have moved into central cities, and so the notion of creating competitive districts is one where you'd have to create pizza slice shaped districts radiating out from every city to the rural areas to make them competitive. And I'm not sure anyone would be happy with that solution.
Right.
Because then you would not have, your district by definition wouldn't have a community of interest.
Nor would it be compact.
Nor would it be compact. So, so there are all kinds of problems that stem from the single-member district winner take all, or what in Europe they call the first past the post.
First past the post. I was talking about British politics. British politics is worse in that regard than here because it's a multi-party system.
Well, and you geographically don't even have to live in the area. There are all kinds of things going on.
Yes, the parties pick their candidates, right. and but it's very easy for the winning party to win with 30-some% of the vote.
Well, and you compound that, and we haven't even talked about the court. You compound it in the court, where you have people getting lifetime appointments and being confirmed by senators that represent less than 40% of the population.
Right.
That while the Senate, while the court was never intended to be a democratic institution, for it to be that at variance with the majority of the American people is something that's problematic, and I think it is part of what has contributed to the declining support of the Supreme Court.
This conversation, this doesn't seem sustainable. Do you think this is sustainable? The sort of political flux that we're in?
The answer is no. Now, what does that mean in terms of politics? The only thing we know for sure about American politics is that it's organic. And what we think we know about American politics in 2023 may not be what American politics is going to look like in 2028. And that's going to be that change is going to happen with or without structural change.
And there is going to be a generational turnover.
There's going to be generational turnover. We know it right now. Every 4 years, of the oldest voters die. I don't like saying that at the age of 69 these days, but that's just a reality.
Sure.
And 4 years of young voters come into the market. Well, in Texas, obviously, the ones that are dying are white folks, and the ones that are coming in are Hispanic folks. That's a profound change in Texas politics, and it's true across the country in that way. And then the issues that confront us. No one knew that Ukraine. One of the issues that caused Kevin McCarthy's demise was support for the Ukraine war. Well, 2 years ago, there was no Ukraine war. So the notion of Americans lining up because of our support or non-support for Ukraine is something that was not on the radar screen even 2 years ago. And I can assure you there's going to be another issue 2 years from now that's going to be that different from the Ukraine. And so we know that those things are going to change. And we know that the result of that is that our politics will change, and it may be that the kind of structural reform that people talk about, let's get rid of the mallymandering, which is a kind of a made-up word that we have, the mallymandering of the Senate. Let's get rid of gerrymandering in the House. Let's give term limits to members of the Supreme Court. All of those are reasonable suggestions. Let's increase the size of the House of Representatives to 700 people or whatever the popular.
It's 650 in Britain. The House of Commons.
Whatever the popular number is these days, right? All of those are solutions. They're all structural changes that would solve some problems. Of course, they would create others, as all reform does. But concentrating on those things alone, I think, misses the point that politics itself is extraordinarily dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're in this interesting period before the 2024 election, which again is going to be one of those unprecedented elections. What's the state of that campaign as you see it right now, between Joe Biden, who's going to be renominated by the Democrats, pending everything there on his side, and the Republican campaign, which sort of feels like that Sitzkrieg portion of World War II, where everybody's just waiting, about 1940, early 41.
Yeah. I mean, what's the most likely outcome? The most likely outcome is that we're going to have a race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, a rematch of the 2020 election. Is that inevitable? The answer is no, and it's not inevitable for a variety of reasons. I mean,
right.
One reason is that the health of both candidates is really in question. It is the case that more people see Joe Biden as feeble these days than see Donald Trump as feeble. But if you're asking me which one's the healthier of the two, it would not be Donald Trump. They're both at the age in their gerontocracy, as some people refer to the national government. They're both at the age where they could have a downturn. I mean, again, I don't have to make this up. I'm 69 years old, and I see what's happening to my friends who are in my age category and older. And guess what? They get sick. They have problems. They have physical issues, mental issues that develop, and Father Time wins that race every time. And so, what are the likelihoods that either Donald Trump or Joe Biden are going to be healthy 4 years from now? They're not real high. That's just a reality, and that affects both of them.
I'm sure
equally.
There's an actuarial table sitting over at some insurance company.
Absolutely,
that can tell us exactly what it is.
And so that's a difference. I don't think it's out of the question that I don't know. I know why Joe Biden hadn't stepped aside yet, and that is the minute he steps aside, he's obviously a lame duck. But might he, for the sake of his son Hunter, decide to step aside and announce in January? I mean, remember in 1968, this is one of my favorite statistics, Lyndon Johnson stepped out of that presidential election on March 31st, 1968, to give others the time to put together campaigns to get the Democratic nomination. And while it is the case that Hubert Humphrey didn't win that election, he might very well have. It wasn't the lack of time that caused him not to get reelected or to get elected in 1968. So is there still time where Joe Biden could step aside? The answer is absolutely there he is. Now, is he going to? Odds are not. Right. But that's not out of the question. Donald Trump, I think, would step aside, when hell freezes over, but hell could freeze over. So it's not at all evident. And the other thing that is a dynamic that I don't think anybody really kind of appreciates is this is a matchup that no one wants.
Right.
No
can
one
you,
wants
can you
it.
think of an analogous campaign to sort of that a 2020
Well,
match?
I would say the 68 election between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon felt kind of close to that, although the dynamics were very difficult. But there's a reason that George Wallace got a high percentage of the vote in the 1968 eletion, and not just in the South in those states that he won, but all over the country.
Oh, sure.
He got a nice high percentage of votes because people were frustrated with the business as usual that was represented by two former vice presidents running against each other. Well, one current and one former vice president running against each other, and so I think that there's a reality there that is possible. So yeah, there have been elections where there have been just as much frustration, I think, but most Democrats would like for Joe Biden not to run for re-election, which has nothing to do with whether they'll support him or not.
Right.
And a majority of Republicans would like to see Donald Trump step aside, even though the majority of them would vote for him if he's the nominee of the party.
But even saying that, who comes after Biden? Who comes after Trump?
Well, the two political parties have done a terrible job of developing a bench. You're right. There's not. My friends ask me, who else the Democrats have? I mean, you can name a few senators. You can name Kamala Harris, obviously, although I think the consensus is that she's not a good national candidate. You can name a few senators. You can name a few governors. but they're not anybody's ever heard of.
Right.
Because
who's Wes Moore to the man on the street?
Exactly.
Or the Josh
right.
Shapiro?
I mean, and the same is true in the Senate. The senators people have heard of are old folks who are not going to be candidates for. I mean, Chuck Schumer's not going to be a candidate for president, and so that's and to some degree you have the same problem in the Republican Party. I mean, just look at the list of candidates running against Donald Trump. I mean, Nikki Haley and who else? I mean, DeSantis is, I think everyone kind of acknowledges now, a non-starter. I mean, it's very difficult.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's that interesting, dynamic within the Republican Party. You can go back to 2012, and you know how every candidate in the Republican Party had their go at the top of the polls. Be it Herman Cain or Newt Gingrich,
Rick
going
Perry.
back to Rick Perry. Oops. But we sort of see that dynamic now, and if Donald Trump were not in the race, I feel like we would see a replay of that, where I'm not sure the base of the Republican Party knows what it wants. Is that fair?
I think that's one of the things. I think one of the things that Trump has done is his cult of personality. I think
policy-wise, there doesn't seem to be a lot of coherence.
That's exactly right. And he is the charismatic leader of the party at this point, and people feel a loyalty to him in that regard. So he's an interesting case study. Biden's very different from that, obviously, as the leader of the Democratic Party. And the Democrats have had good success. I mean, whenever somebody says, do the Democrats have anybody who could win the election, I say, well, have you ever heard of Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton?
Barack Obama.
Well, right. Although Obama had become kind of a cult figure by the time he got the nomination, but nobody had ever heard of Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton.
Jimmy who?
Yeah. So the notion of those guys coming from from Plains, Georgia, to the presidency, hi, I'm Jimmy Carter and I'm running for president.
Happy belated birthday to President Carter.
Yeah. Is just remarkable. So the Democrats have had this happen, and George W. Bush did it in the Republican Party, but of course that's a special case. But he was a non-starter just a few years before he got the nomination too.
Right.
I mean, he was the Hunter Biden of the Republican Party.
Well, and I think a lot of folks forget that one of the reasons why Al Gore won the popular vote and why the race was basically a toss-up was because of the revelation of the DUI in New Hampshire, Maine, one of those things that harkened back to his alcoholism days. Excuse me. Well, how much of this, going back to the issue of gerontocracy, and we just had Senator Dianne Feinstein who passed away, surprising absolutely nobody, because she's been very frail, very ill for a long time. It is that so much of, and it's not just in politics. No, not a statement on you, Jim, but in society that baby boom generation, a very large generation, is still in the workplace. They're still in the halls of power, and there hasn't been that handover to either Gen X or the millennials. I mean,
I have a philosophy. I don't have an answer. I mean, the answer to the problem is for people to learn to graciously step aside. That there are others who can follow in their footsteps and better represent the feelings of the next generation. And I don't think that it's unique to the baby boomers. It's happened with the baby boomers in part because of the population bubble associated with the baby boomers. But I don't think anyone has ever been, gracious in general about stepping away from power. Whether you're talking, about Strom Thurmond or name a number of Republicans that have done the same, or Democrats that have done the same thing and just hung on forever and ever. People who are in power are addicted to power, and it's very hard for them to step aside. Dianne Feinstein, to be honest, should have stepped, and the Democrats in California wanted her to step aside 6 years ago, and she chose not to. I think the same thing's going on in San Francisco right now with Nancy Pelosi, who's declared she's going to run for yet another term in the House. I mean, there's somebody in San Francisco who could do a good job of representing that state. But I didn't see Mitch McConnell step aside willingly either. I mean, this is not something. The senator from Iowa, who's Grassley.
Yeah, Chuck Grassley.
How old is Chuck Grassley? So this is not a problem that's related to one party or one part of the country. Mm-hmm. It's just simply related to the fact that people who are in power don't want to give up power. And this is very different from what the framers wanted. The framers did not put term limits on things. The 8-year term limit was not added to the Constitution until Franklin Roosevelt dared to run for a third term. People kind of attributed constitutionality to something that was not constitutional at all, based upon the fact that George Washington was a strange guy who decided to voluntarily walk away from power.
Right.
And nothing less. So that's always been the exception rather than the norm. Mm-hmm. But the framers of the Constitution, I think that most of them saw politics not as a vocation but as an avocation. Many of them, in fact, juggled job and public service together, and none of them anticipated getting rich in public service. And so it's kind of an interesting. This professional class of politicians is something that I think the framers just didn't really understand.
You saying that the framers didn't anticipate political consultants getting points on on commercials in the five media markets?
Right.
Okay. Well, tell me, what projects do you have in the pipeline as we're wrapping up here?
I'm at a lucky stage in my career where I'm no longer seeking fame as a political scientist. I'm working on things that I enjoy.
Yeah.
So I've got a little collection of essays about Jim Wright coming out in the spring.
Perfect.
That'll be fun, from scholars who've written about him in different times. I'm working on a project of a political cartoonist here in Fort Worth who is a very wonderful one. She was one of the very first women in the political cartoon business.
That is very unusual.
Etta Hume, and she's one of the best cartoonists of recent times, in my view. And then I've got. I'm working with Keith Gaddy a little bit on a Texas Courthouse project as well. So we have a lot of things going on.
You can't keep Gaddy out of these courthouses.
Oh, Gaddy,
I swear.
No, you can't.
No, he'll be a tremendous addition to your department and this university.
Yeah,
I have no doubt about that. But that's really interesting about the cartoonists and working in the archives. I have to say, one of the most popular collections, regardless of who the artist is always editorial cartoons. I think they're so accessible.
And they were the commentary of the time. Etta Hume, here's one of her cartoons on the desk. I've got a whole bunch of them.
Perfect.
In fact,
look at that.
Those are all, and just wonderful commentary about
Are those here in your special collections?
They're actually, she was the editorial cartoonist for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. There were two editorial cartoonists. The Star-Telegram.
Different time.
The Star-Telegram had a morning and an afternoon edition.
Right.
And so we already have, the TCU Press has already published a collection of the works of Harold Maples, who was the conservative morning political cartoonist. Not published a collection of Etta Hume, who was the liberal afternoon cartoonist, and his cartoons are.
You know anybody on the press advisory board who could change
I'm
that?
on it. Yeah. His Harold Maples collection is at TCU. Etta Hume's is with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram's archives over at the University of Texas at Arlington.
There's a lot of copyright issues involved in that.
Yeah. But I have permission to publish.
There you go. That's the critical thing. And as an archivist, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point that out. Excuse me. Well, is there anything else you'd like to record for posterity, or you want to make any predictions that we can come back and shake our head at, in a year or so?
Well, I mean, come back in a year. Keith will be here, and I'll be here.
I'll come back when it's cooler.
Yes.
I thought waiting till October I would be safe.
Yeah.
Boy, was I
gosh,
wrong.
the weather has been just wild this summer. We're getting a cold front tonight, so
hey now,
it'll be.
You're welcome. I'll take the credit.
Yeah, it'll be wet and cold. It'll be 81 tomorrow. So we haven't seen those temperatures since probably, I don't know, April.
Oh gosh. It's. I'm always amazed at just the scale of Texas. And don't get me wrong, Georgia is the largest state geographically east of the Mississippi. It's a big state.
Yeah.
It takes,
and has 180 counties, 180 something counties?
It has 100. Oh my gosh.
I think it's 184, but don't hold me to that. Texas has 254, of course.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe I think it's 150.
Keith would know.
Yeah, Keith would know. But it takes 5.5 hours to get from Athens to St. Simon's Island, and about the same, going to Southwest Georgia. But here in Texas, I came out here to pick up a collection from General Habiger, who was an Air Force general, and 159. I was right.
159.
159. County consolidation was always a windmill that sort of gadfly state legislators always like to tilt at.
Sure.
And you could get away. I mean, it's the same. Why is there a Loving County, Texas, with 25 people in it? I don't know.
But quite a few have Angora goats.
Well, but I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court always said that it's people, not Angora goats, who vote. But we came to pick up that collection, and we flew to San Antonio. But when you pick up 30 boxes, banker boxes, they don't let you fly back with those. It's problematic on Delta even. So I had to drive back. I left at 11 a.m. and I didn't get to Shreveport, Louisiana until like 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
I was just like, oh.
Well, there's these wonderful statistics. The distance from Brownsville, Texas, at the tip of Texas, to the state line in the Panhandle is longer than it is from the state line in the Panhandle to the Canadian border.
So if I went from from the Panhandle to Canada is closer.
Right. The distance from the East Texas line on Interstate 10 and El Paso is shorter than it is from El Paso or longer than it is from El Paso to Los Angeles. And vice versa. It's if you go from El Paso to the East Texas, it's shorter to the Atlantic Ocean than it is. So it's a huge state geographically. And my favorite statistic is if you're in Dalhart, Texas, you're closer to 5 state capitals than you are to Austin.
Oh, wow.
You're closer to Denver, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Oklahoma City, Topeka, Kansas, and
probably Santa Fe.
And Santa Fe.
Yeah. Well, most of my knowledge from Texas comes from King of the Hill. So, which I will
sophisticated stuff. It's better than it was a generation ago when it was all from Dallas.
Right.
Right.
Well, yeah. I'm not that old.
That was when I became JR all of a sudden.
Well, there's an episode of King of the Hill where there's a Boston home developer. I think he's developing subdivisions, and he's coming down to Arlen, and he thinks everybody's J.R. Ewing.
Yeah.
He makes Hank. He's got to wear the hat and take him out.
And of course,
his Cadillac.
this is a fun story. We were talking about Jim Wright. Jim Wright was Larry Hagman's boxing coach in Weatherford, Texas.
Oh my God.
Weatherford. See, Larry Hagman's mom was Mary Martin.
Okay.
Peter, the original Peter Pan, and the two greatest people to come out of Weatherford, Texas, are Jim Wright and Mary Martin.
Well, there you
go.
go.
And Mary Martin's husband Hagman was a native of Weatherford as well.
Well, Jim, we could do this all day, but I know you have to.
I have to go teach a class. You want to come for me?
I mean, well, I've I've done it on less notice than that before. Believe me.
Well, I always tell people that if you want me to speak an hour, I'm ready to do that right now. But if you want it 20 minutes, it's going to take me some time to prepare.
Like a gas, I will fill my container.
Yeah,
but yes,
right.
yeah, 20 minutes is. I had to give a 20-minute talk about the New Deal in Georgia.
Oh wow!
And I was like, whew.
Yeah.
The whole class period I could do.
Yeah.
20 minutes was that's tough for this historian.
That's tough. That's right.
Well, thank you, Jim, on behalf of the University of Georgia, two-time reigning football national champions.
Thank you for mentioning that again.
Who won 65-7 over the TCU Horned Frogs in January. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Appreciate it.